Hello, my name is Dusan Vujovic, and I will be talking to you today about MTEFs, medium-term expenditure frameworks, mainly based on the World Bank book called Beyond Annual Budgets. Today's presentation is going to have two parts. The first part will deal with design principles and good practice in the MTEFs. The second part will deal with cases of Austria, New Zealand, and Serbia. Now, in more detail, the structure in the first part, there will be an overview of MTEFs as a new process and method for better PFM in the medium term. So it's not just an additional document that we will do and put on the shelf. It's a different approach to managing public resources, to managing public finance, as we will discuss later. In the second part, we will discuss three country cases. Each has its special meaning in this process. There will be a brief discussion of the case of Austria, which is more advanced in terms of budget accounting and is relatively new in terms of introducing medium-term expenditure frameworks, and New Zealand, which is one of the most advanced countries in budget transparency in the movement towards performance frameworks for medium-term expenditures. Finally, there's going to be a more detailed discussion of the Serbian case, where I had the chance to gain first-hand experience as the Minister of Finance in Serbia between 2014 and 2018. Now, for this particular presentation that was originally done on November 22nd, this presentation was also a basis for subsequent discussion with participants from many countries in the East Asia and Pacific region, discussing the hurdles and the political economy issues that could be hampering the introduction of MTEF concept, as well as legal, administrative, and management changes that MTEFs require, depending on country circumstances, and finally about implementation challenges. The first part of the presentation will first consider, or I group my considerations in the heading, what are MTEFs and what can they do for us? MTEFs, as I said, is a new approach to budgeting and PFM, which allows strategic forward-looking approach, which corrects the usual limitations of annual budgets, which is that you have to cut everything at the end of the fiscal year, in most countries December 31st, and then resume anew in the next year. And by establishing priorities within sectors and across sectors, as well as allocating resources in line with development priorities. This has always been the challenge. We talk about development priorities, but we are less certain that what we do in the budgets connects development priorities to our allocation of resources. Under good medium-term expenditure frameworks, public expenditures are limited only by true availability of resources, unlike annual budgets, where sometimes short-term liquidity considerations or short-term political considerations can hamper the allocation of resources or can derail the processes that have been agreed earlier. They also reflect spending priorities, and they allow us to do allocation of resources cost effectively, in other words, based on programs, projects, and other ways of measuring performance. Finally, MTEFs allow good public financial management through aggregate fiscal discipline, to improved allocative efficiency, and through technical efficiency. Now, MTEFs, for the longest time, we were missing the formal link between the macro fiscal policy objectives, which are usually stated as value judgments and then implemented through macro modeling framework, and the budgeting processes and procedures. And the link was essentially reduced to a couple of numbers that were coming from the macro fiscal policy objectives and being used in budgeting. Now, this MTF, or multi-year medium-term expenditure framework, is important for many countries today because many of the medium-term fiscal adjustment programs require more than 1 year. They're typically 3 to 4 years. Some of these are supported by the IMF programs. They're also very important when a country pursues multi-year fiscal targets and permanent fiscal rules that cut across individual fiscal year, as well as to do debt sustainability analysis, which actually goes beyond even the 3-4 years and frequently requires considerations of loans that go 10, 15, even 40 years in some cases from bilateral donors. Now, MTF are very important because they also show government commitment to high quality budget process and high quality adjustment, because they prioritize spending and they reduce waste, which is part of the regular budgeting process and part of the implementation. Now, MTEFs generate good fiscal performance based on the quality of budgeting and the credibility of the budgets. They reduce typical shortcomings of annual budgets by achieving realism in projecting revenues and in projecting what new borrowing or resources from new borrowing can realistically be achieved. And finally, MTFs allow spending to be aligned with medium-term sector strategies and national development strategies. There are 4 specific improvements that MTFs allow, and they've been openly stated in the literature, which I will mention at the end of this presentation. First, MTFs give voice to spending agencies. Instead of being simple compliance organizational units that wait for the signals from the Ministry of Finance or signals from the Parliament or signals from the top of government, they become active participants in this process because they contribute to the design of programs and projects, and they are allowed to flexibly use the resources to pursue important development objectives. Without this, MTEF framework would be underutilized and will not deliver the full benefits. Also, another achievement is that budgets have multi-year spending allocations. So instead of ending everything at the end of the fiscal year, one can actually hope not only in programs and projects, but also in other activities and in pursuit of other development objectives would allow multi-year spending allocations. Finally, they allow budgets to be linked to results. So instead of moving from control of inputs, where you would get money to buy construction materials and then just account for how much cement and asphalt you put in a road, to a mix of inputs that are related not to the use of inputs, but to the achievement of outputs and outcomes. In this particular example, outputs will be the kilometers of or miles of roads, bridges and overpasses and so forth, but the outcomes will be reduction in times to get from point A to point B, and reduction in waste, in accidents, in preservation of human life. And the last element is that MTEF systematically allow great fiscal transparency and accountability. Now, there are 3 stages within the MTEF process. The simplest stage is the MTEF fiscal framework. So it is a framework that essentially just establishes macroeconomic aggregate resource envelope, and they allocate this across spending agencies. It's important to note that these are established realistically, but they are transmitted down in a one-way process, top down, from the Ministry of Finance to all the spending agencies. Next step in the development or depth of medium-term expenditure frameworks is to move to the budget framework, which is a two-way process. The first step in the process is the same as MTEF, which is you establish macroeconomic aggregate resource envelope. But then you inform the agencies that they come back to the Ministry of Finance requesting their budget or resource allocation in line with their planned agency and ministry and sector program ceilings. So this two-way process is enhancing the approach and is actually adding a more active role of the ministries and agencies. Horizontal reallocation of resources is possible both within and across sectors, and they are done as part of a sectoral strategy of the national development or investment strategy. Finally, the third and the most promising stage of the medium-term expenditure framework is the performance framework, which is based on an iterative process. So the first step is for the Ministry of Finance to establish national resource envelopes. That triggers the discussion of programs, outputs, and outcomes between all the active users of public or budget resources, and the result of this discussion is convergence towards allocation of resources that is aligned with the achievement of outputs, outcomes, and certain performance measures. In some cases, we cannot measure direct outputs and outcomes, but we can measure performance in different ways. So this is what the most developed level of medium-term framework does for us. Now, the technical objectives of the MTEF is to improve the fiscal situation macroeconomically, improve the impact of government policies, and improve performance of all the programs and projects. In more detail, the synergy between MTEFs and the budget process, because the budget process, if you look at the note on this slide, is that MTEFs are not a separate document. They have to be planned as a medium-term framework, but implemented as part of the regular budget process. So therefore, it's implemented through 5 stages of the preparation of the budget. The first one is in defining the macroeconomic envelopes or limitations or availability of resources. The second one is observing objectives and aligning public resources with objectives in a top-down approach. The third stage is going the other way around, going from bottom up, linking those resource allocations and means by the sector. So that's basically establishing a realism of the allocation of resources. And finally, in stages 4 and 5, one is reconciling resource needs with means, and the other one is reconciling strategic policies with means. That means that the budgets are realistic, they're not limited to 1 year, and they are aligned with available resources, observing priorities and impact on the project impact on first output and then outcome. Now, there are many factors and constraints in developing and implementing medium-term expenditure framework. We will talk about some of them in the case studies, but some of the general ones coming out of existing studies done by the World Bank, OECD, and others, is that poor data or lack of data, either unreliable data or complete lack of data on performance on many aspects of the use of resources within the budgets. The second constraint is, or a factor potentially undermining MTEFs, is the weak public financial management system and insufficient human resource capacity to do it. This admittedly requires much deeper and greater knowledge across key ministries, key resource allocating ministries such as Ministry of Finance or the Treasury in some countries, and the Ministry of Economy or Ministry of Industry and many other key, and all the line agencies and all the sectoral ministries that deal with the allocation of resources. The third constraint is that there are a lot of off-budget items in many countries, and you will see in some countries like New Zealand, this is explicitly forbidden by the law. There are large off-budget items such as pension funds are completely outside the budget. There are many other funds, development funds or social security, social assurance funds that are outside the budget. The second constraint is the earmarking, where specific tax or tax-like instruments are linked to specific allocations, so that earmarking specific instruments to specific uses reduces flexibility in the budget. In some cases, they create a sense of reliability of the revenues, but on the other level, it basically limits the ability of the Ministry of Finance and other agencies responsible for the mobilization of resources and public financial management to use policies across the board. Therefore, this is a limitation. Finally, in many countries, actually, with a lot of fiscal resources, the problem is the existence of parallel capital budgets. The special capital budgets for the third millennium, capital budgets for specific regional or other targets that are not synchronized with the overall budget. Special investment programs actually undermine the coverage and the reliability of the medium-term expenditure framework. Next factor potentially undermining the MTEFs is the large execution variance, which basically means poor budgeting. It means actually that the approved budgets are frequently very different from the implementation, and the revisions of the budget supplements and so forth are very frequent. This creates a complete chaos in the overall budget process. Nobody knows where we are in this process, as if all the errors are corrected through revisions of the budget and significant departures from the planned budget, then the planning loses its meaning. And finally, MT are constrained by the existence of other planning processes. Many countries have retained some sort of a national planning. Initially, medium-term expenditure frameworks can coexist with these longer-term planning processes, but in the longer run, they have to be reconciled or merged because the existence of parallel planning, essentially mechanisms with different conclusions, different analytical bases, and different policy recommendations also creates confusion in expectations. In the summary, what are the good practices so far with the medium-term expenditure frameworks? First, with the simplest one, the medium-term fiscal framework, it is good macroeconomic and revenue forecasts are the best practice. The use of debt sustainability models for longer-term debt and aid commitments and debt situation. And finally, the systematic issue of by the Ministry of Finance of macro fiscal objectives in a consolidated paper, call it fiscal strategy or some other name. Medium-term budgetary framework, as we said, a two-way process. It's good practice says that it starts with the fiscal strategy, whereas the first one actually ends with the fiscal strategy. Then the budget letter from the Ministry of Finance to all the users of budget resources explain expenditure ceilings, initial expenditure ceilings and cost assumptions, and actually invite spending agencies to request allocations that are aligned with their planned activities. And then finally, agreeing on the allocations and publishing those allocations is the third or the fourth step in this process that has been recognized as good practice. Finally, medium-term performance framework, the most comprehensive of the medium-term frameworks, basically offers the design of sector strategies that discuss the program outputs, outcomes, and performance indicators, and then use that as a basis to basically challenge or develop budget targets and link them to potential outputs, outcomes, and performance. Spending agencies, after that, once these are agreed, report on the achievement of results, and the comprehensive spending reviews actually done by independent agencies and focused on the specific agencies and ministries is the final element of the good practice in the medium-term performance framework. Now, across the world, medium-term expenditure frameworks were not a very common feature of the budget processes. Very few countries has MTEFs before the year 2000. After year 2000, the simplest, the fiscal framework, is the most dominant format. Budget frameworks are large and dominant in the ECA, Europe and Central Asia, the division or region defined in the World Bank, and the Sub-Saharan Africa. And the performance frameworks are dominant in advanced economies. There are some exceptions to this rule, which I will mention in a minute. East Asia started late in this process, so most of the medium-term expenditure frameworks are fiscal frameworks, and some of them are budget frameworks. We expect that they will move towards performance frameworks. Now, a large share, or an expectedly large share, of performance frameworks in Sub-Saharan Africa seems to be driven by donor funding and donor assistance rather than generated through budget considerations in those countries, with few exceptions, such as South Africa. Scope for advancing medium-term expenditure systems beyond fiscal framework to budget framework and seems ample and very likely. However, capacity constraints make adoption of the performance framework less likely at this time and foreseeable future. We'll have to wait for capacity to be developed. Now, in terms of dynamics, a few graphs that illustrate this. As you see in this graph, until at the end of the 20th century, 1997, there are very few systematic medium-term expenditure frameworks. Then it takes off. Overall, fiscal frameworks lead, followed by the budgetary frameworks, followed by the performance frameworks, which are the fewest. By type of countries, budgetary frameworks are dominant in Europe and Central Asia, and in advanced economies to some extent. Performance frameworks dominate among advanced economies. There are few exceptions to this rule. Performance frameworks in Europe and Central Asia, and few in Sub-Saharan Africa. None in the Latin America, none in the Middle East, none in South Asia, and none in East Asia and Pacific. And the rest is dominated by the fiscal framework. By type of countries and dynamics, we'll see a huge increase towards the end of the 20th century and early years of the 21st century. In advanced economies, there's a systematic high level of introduction of fiscal frameworks. Relatively few budget frameworks in advanced economies, and then a huge increase in performance frameworks. In East Asia and Pacific, very low level of medium-term frameworks until 2005, and then a huge increase in fiscal frameworks and some budgetary frameworks, none performance frameworks. In Europe and Central Asia, excluding advanced economies in those regions, there was a huge increase in fiscal frameworks, and then followed by the budgetary framework. Performance frameworks are there, but they're still exception to the rule. And then finally, in the Caribbean of the selection of regions, the same dynamics from 2002 onwards they are dominated by the fiscal framework with a little bit of budgetary framework. In summary, good MTEFs promote fiscal discipline, allow real selection of priorities within and across sectors, not based on fake short-term budget constraints or fiscal or resource constraints, not based on short-term political negotiations, but based on true longer-term priorities. MTEFs enable shift from unproductive spending to more productive spending on economic and social infrastructure, on health and education, which proved to be the key factors of development, and development-friendly activities meeting the ESG, which is the environmental, social, and governance impact, which is the right way to assess the efficiency of public investment. Finally, medium-term expenditure frameworks or multi-year expenditure frameworks reduce volatility and provide stability of financing, allowing a true orientation towards results. If somebody allows you to have 3-4 years, you can establish a meaningful link from inputs to outputs and from outputs to outcomes. Longer, immediate outcomes, medium-term outcomes, and long-term outcomes, which is the essence of the budgeting process. Now, we move to case studies. 3 case studies, as I said: Austria, New Zealand, and Serbia. Austria is a country with a well-organized public accounting and budgeting system. It came late with the formal medium-term expenditure framework only in 2009, and then it quickly moved to performance-based budgeting, albeit somewhat limited, but it had a very developed and well-organized public finance, administration, and accounting rules. So therefore, the move was grounded on good professional knowledge and huge capacity. Also, it has a high sensitivity for gender issues. So Austria is one of the leaders in having performance-based budgeting with the central role of the gender aspects. It also maintains the dual budgeting and financial reporting in both cash and accrual basis. For the longest time, the country was using the cash-based system, and then it recently introduced accrual-based system and continues to use both systems in both planning and implementation and financial reporting. Important feature of the Austrian case is that they have a strong parliament budget office, which is a professional office within the parliament that actually helps the budget committee and makes the work of the budget committee, which is populated by deputies, members of parliament, much more effective and much more oriented towards results and the criticism of what's going on. It's important that Austria Ministry of Finance has huge responsibilities, and Austria has a huge vertical fiscal imbalances because many subnational budgets depend on transfers from the federal budget. Fiscal equalization law attempted to resolve some of these issues, but we hear from recent reports that many problems still persist. Finally, the medium-term expenditure framework and the performance framework is fully aligned with the annual budgets. Following the standard OECD principles, it's a 4-year rolling medium-term expenditure framework. It does budgeting of capital and current expenditures at the same time, and the multi-year funding is made available upfront. Ministry of Finance retains a very heavy control role, and it individually approves all the large projects. There's a decent level of public availability of information. 7 out of 8 main budget reports are available publicly. Comprehensive reporting goes to Parliament. Hearings are limited to experts There are no citizen guides, and it's a limited involvement of civil society in the budget process. As I already said, cash and accrual budgeting and reporting is consistently applied, following the true and fair view of the budget transactions. The execution of the budget is entirely done through the single treasury account, so that there's one place where all the transactions are done. This makes it easier to follow what's happening. Gender budgeting is integrated, and Austria seems to be the leader in that sense. Impact assessment is relatively new. It's done both ex ante and ex post, and spending reviews are being recently introduced. Regarding fiscal risk, they go with 30-year projections. Ministries do the fiscal management. Ministry of Finance just aggregates those and looks at the overall impact. Finally, Supreme Audit Institution checks all the spending, financial and performance audits. New Zealand, the leader in many respects in the area of medium-term performance framework, moved officially to well-being budget since 2019. Now, this is one of the first countries that is actually putting the living standards of the population up front as the main criterion for evaluating the budgets, the allocation of fiscal resources, and the evaluation of investment and funding decisions. Basically, the budget process is enhanced to improve the allocation of resources. It's based on a long experience with accrual budgeting and a 5-year experience with the new accounting standards based on IPSAS. Central Budgeting Authority, which is Treasury in the case of New Zealand, which is a unitary state, it has an important feature on which some of the budget discipline rests, which is that no off-budget expenditures are allowed. So many countries have issue with off-budget expenditures, with earmarked expenditures, not in New Zealand. So this level of flexibility is not allowed. Finally, Parliament has a very strong role in this, and they have a role to issue rulings on the budget that have the same strength as the law, and the MTEF performance framework is fully aligned with the budget process. In terms of the standard OECD principles, they don't follow exogenous rules. They follow the policy objectives stated in the publicly disclosed documents of the government. Budget initiatives are assessed against stated government priorities. It's a 4-year rolling program. It's adjusted annually and improved by the Parliament as needed. New capital initiatives are notionally allowed but evaluated competitively, so that they have to meet the competitive test before they are approved for funding. New Zealand is a transparency leader in the fiscal area. Information is shared with citizens, parliaments, and so forth. However, there's a structured scrutiny of the budget ex ante and ex post in Parliament. There's no fiscal council, which has been frequently used as the control mechanism in many transition economies. And there's no public participation in the budget process. So in New Zealand, which is the leader, they really do not go into extensive discussions during the budget. The discussions are done vis-a-vis the stated programs of the government. So the new government comes based on a specific program. They're supposed to transfer this program into budget allocations, and the results achieved by the budget are the basis to evaluate the programs and the success of the government. Like Austria, they also follow cash and accrual, budgeting and reporting on both cash and accrual basis. The execution of the budget is done through single treasury account. All expenditures must be done through single treasury account. Performance budgets are linked to the achievement of output. This is one of the countries that is most advanced in that area, and independent performance audits assess the achievement of results by ministry. so that each ministry, so the Prime Minister would know exactly how successful each of the ministries was in setting realistic objectives, bidding for resources on that basis, and achieving those results. In terms of fiscal risk, they follow a 40-year longest fiscal projections, which are done on a regular basis and regular updates, which serve as the basis to respond to any changes in circumstances or expectations. So the Ministry of Finance or the Treasury in this particular case will provide policy advice how to respond to new risks and new challenges. Supreme Audit Institution basically does both the accounting for results and the performance audit statements. Finally, we move to the Serbian case, which I would label the introduction of the medium-term expenditure framework, along with program-based budgeting and fiscal consolidation. In early stages, MTEFs and public or performance-based budgeting, program-based budgeting, have been around since the start of economic reforms in 2000. Initially, program-based budgeting was introduced in 5 pilot ministries, but then it ran out of steam by 2005. MTFs were introduced with the new budget system law, organic budget law, in 2009, and again went dormant immediately after the introduction. And the reason for this, for both stall in the process of program-based budgeting and medium-term expenditure frameworks, is that there were a lot of resources from grants and remittances in those years immediately following the big economic reforms. So the consumption-based growth between 2001 and 2008 basically created optimism regarding large growth rates of GDP, but also increases in private incomes and consumption, which actually serve as a basis to support political economy opposition to reform, which are essentially stalled. And these pressures were inspired by the desire to increase pensions and public sector wages, as well as continue financing failed or loss-making state-owned enterprises and state-owned banks. The situation changed after the global economic crisis and the change of government in 2012. The democratic-led government lost the elections to the present coalition of Serbian National Party, and PE, political economy opposition to macro-fiscal reform, basically weakened, lost steam. This was the time to launch the considerable fiscal consolidation program 2015-2018. Now this is the background for the resumption of the work on the multi-year expenditure framework, as the fiscal consolidation in those circumstances required 3 to 4 years to design and implement critical reforms and make them sustainable. Now, the nature of the MTEFs and program-based budgeting hybrid in connection with fiscal consolidation is very country-specific. MTEFs were designed as a relatively short 3-year rolling MTEFs fiscal frameworks done through relatively solid macroeconomic forecasting, fiscal projections of revenues and aggregate expenditures, and separate detailed debt sustainability analysis, which was both the need of a country to manage long inherited external debt, but also a requirement of the international financial institutions that supported the reforms in the 2001-2008 period. Now, program-based budgeting, although in early stages, became an important tool that was actually not working against MTEFs, but was actually working in synergy with MTEFs. The reason is, A, that it allowed the way to expand the linear budgets to include medium-term capital expenditures and also to include infrastructure investment in the treatment in the creation of the budget. In terms of OECD principles, Serbia MTEF is a 3-year rolling plan. It approves capital and current expenditures together. Most large projects were multi-year funding, especially those from IFIs, and this was all done part of the program-based budgeting. So this is where they merge. In terms of transparency and reporting, the few budget reports are made public. There's no performance information. These are the weaknesses of the Serbian MTEF system, and there's delayed reporting to Parliament. This has been basically explained by the current political debates and political challenges. Fiscal Council played a very important role during years where Serbia was not ready to accept a fiscal consolidation program, while the program that I led in the 2014-2018, while the program was strong and clear, Fiscal Council role was not that important. After 2018, with some fiscal difficulties caused by the COVID and other fiscal challenges, the role of the Fiscal Council is increasing again. In Serbia, budgets are done on cash basis, and there's cash reporting only, except for certain elements where Supreme Audit Institution includes accrual aspects of the budget planning and budget implementation and execution, which creates confusion. SDA execution is large and growing, and is being expanded to include all the education system. So in few years. In the next few years, it's going to be almost 100% coverage. Elements of performance budgeting are integrated in the system, particularly in the areas of infrastructure, health, and similar social infrastructure projects, because the funding is done through those programs, either co-financed by the EU or international financial institutions. There is no little or no impact assessment in Serbia. Ministry of Finance regarding risk management plays a key role and has a new department that has been recently established, but they still have to develop longer-term projections that will serve to identify forthcoming fiscal risks and the proper way to respond to them. Supreme Audit Institution, as I said, checks in detail all the spendings and does financial audits, but has not actually moved to performance audits. This will be the task for the next period. Now, the synergy between MTEFs and program-based budgeting and fiscal consolidation is very interesting, because in Serbia the factors that enhance the importance of these changes were more important than the political economy factors that dominated during good times. So despite initial resistance, basically, the synergy between PBB and MTEFs enable the country to be better in preparing projects for IFI financing and some important projects financed from bilateral sources, and to obtain budget support for important analytical work, which is critical in the areas of environment, in the areas of energy, in the areas of restructuring agriculture, building the proper network of roads and railways to connect Serbia to the rest of Europe, and as part of the One Belt, One Road initiative, Chinese initiative, but also prioritize resource allocation and other sector interventions. Now, please note that sector allocations of budget resources, the discretionary part, is still dominated by ad hoc political considerations, which happens in all the countries. But here the issue is that these considerations are really ad hoc, and they are not fully aligned with a couple of long-term documents. One of them is the public financial management strategy of the country, but the other one is the country partnership framework with the World Bank. The third one is the economic reform program done with the EU, and then these are the other medium-term programs done by the EU, by EBRD, by EIB, bilateral donors, and so forth. So there's scope for improvement in this area. Management uses of MTEFs and PBB are becoming more and more important because they helped build capacity to improve PFM. The readiness to improve public financial management was there, but the capacity to do it was not there. And then the issue was also to achieve more advanced levels of MTEF, which is to move from budgetary framework to elements or early stages of the performance framework is critically or hinges on their ability to first plan good energy projects, especially moving to renewable sources, but also to regional initiatives, regional infrastructure initiatives, and other regional initiatives, including research and development and other important aspects of guiding future investment, environmentally friendly investment. So readiness to move to performance-based budgeting. Potential readiness is there, but the ability to do it is not yet there. And it will require a lot of political and social commitment, time and effort to do it. Recent example with delayed and in the end failed attempt to introduce performance-based pay scale confirms that. This is the quick summary of the Serbian case, which basically says that unlike expectations, synergy between fiscal consolidation in difficult circumstances with stalled or temporarily stalled program-based budgeting and MTEF can enhance each other and actually move forward. But in order to achieve higher levels and greater efficiency of these, sustained effort is needed over many years. I hope that this effort will be sustained in the coming years. Finally, let me just mention a couple of sources on which this presentation is based and which you may want to consider as a source of additional information. One is the Beyond the Annual Budget report of the World Bank from 2013, Best Practice for Performance Budgeting by OECD from 2018, as well as some earlier publications, but still classical publications in the area of managing public expenditures by the World Bank and OECD. Thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, please channel them through our organizers, and we'll be happy to respond either through video conferencing or through emails.